Welcome to Day of Change's second block. In this block, we will cover the patriarchy, toxic masculinity, and misogyny, and the subsequent culture that they influence. The goal of today is to open informed conversations about how the patriarchy and systems of gender oppression affect and are perpetuated by everyone. We know liberation from this oppression involves the work of every single one of us and will liberate us all. We hope that by starting these conversations, we can begin to inform and inspire change. If you are neutral in situations of injustice, you have chosen the side of the oppressor. Please remember our norms during this block, and if you need a reminder, please refer to the norms sheet. A mandated reporter is a person who must report instances of sexual assault, harassment, and rape. All staff at BHS are mandated reporters. The symbol that you see on the screen indicates that the next slide will have heavy and potentially triggering content. This slide will pop up throughout presentations today, followed by a short pause to give time for an individual to prepare for the content or decide to skip the next part. We encourage you all to do whatever feels right when you see that sign, whether it be taking a drink of water, taking a walk, turning off your camera, or going to seek support from a BHS social worker or guidance counselor. This block will focus on gender-based oppression, toxic masculinity, and internal and external misogyny. Additionally, we will discuss how these systems impact everyone, regardless of gender. This presentation will consider these issues in both systemic and interpersonal contexts. The block concludes with thought-provoking questions to influence internal action to change the culture in our community.
The patriarchy is both societal and structural, so it shows up in systems such as education, law, and health, as well as interpersonally among people. The patriarchy shows up in whose stories we tell and from what perspective we learn history. The patriarchy also is prevalent in popular culture and influences what we view as feminine or masculine and whether we associate femininity and masculinity as positive or negative. It is also closely tied into systems of racism, classism, ableism, etc., and cannot be discussed without talking about those systems as well. In this presentation, we hope to begin conversations around masculinity, the patriarchy, and misogyny, and its negative effects on all of us.
Structural impacts of the patriarchy are seen across all institutions. Examples of this can be seen in the medical field, government, and more. In the next slide, we'll look at some statistics regarding these impacts. Content warning. The next section of this presentation contains mentions of rape and sexual assault. Please feel free to step out or turn off your sound and camera.
In order to understand how gender dynamics present themselves in society, it is important for us to understand the privilege that men receive right from birth. Male privilege is a system of advantages or rights that are available to men solely on the basis of their gender. A man's access to these benefits may vary depending on how closely they match their society's ideal masculine norm. As we have discussed, the patriarchy is a system that harms everyone, regardless of gender identity. However, it is built to advantage cisgender men. Some examples of male advantage are having more representation in politics and in higher up positions within the workforce. Only 24% of U.S. senators are women. Of those women, only 36% are women of color. Only 6% of CEOs for Fortune 500 companies are women. Often, female-identifying people's respectability is based on their physical appearance. Male-identifying people's physical appearance normally does not determine the respect they get.
People are not one-dimensional, and there are many different systems of oppression that affect us all. Cisgender and heterosexual privilege intersect with male privilege. In order to fully understand male privilege, we must be able to fully understand the spectrums of sexuality and gender. Cisgender and transgender men experience male privilege, but trans men don't have cisgender privilege. Additionally, men who are both cis and gay will experience cisgender and male privilege, but they do not have heterosexual privilege. All of these identities intersect under patriarchal oppression and are crucial to better understanding how the patriarchy affects us all. Gender-based violence is abuse that is directed towards an individual based on their sex or gender identity.
Sexual misconduct and other gender-based violence are often called women's issues that just some men help out with. In this TED Talk, Jackson Katz reframes sexual misconduct as a men's issue and shows how these violent behaviors are tied to definitions of manhood. Katz says that accepting sexual abuse as intrinsically a men's issue is the first step to calling out unacceptable behavior and becoming leaders of change.
Before I begin my presentation, I want to say it's a great honor for me to be part of a program with so many impressive women. I also want to say, and thank you to the organizers to invite me to be part of this. It's important that I say, and that men say, when we do the work that we do, and especially in the field of gender violence prevention that I'm going to talk with you about this morning, it's important that we acknowledge that the growing movement of men in the United States, in a multicultural sense, and all around the world in an international sense, the growing movement of men who are standing up and speaking out about men's violence against women and going into parts of male culture that have historically been either apathetic about or openly hostile to women's efforts to engage them. That movement of men is indebted to the leadership of women on a personal level, on a professional level, on a political level, on an intellectual level, on every level. Women built these movements, and these are movements that are affecting, in a positive way, everybody, not just women and girls, but also men and boys. And oftentimes men like myself get a lot of credit and public acclaim for doing the work that women have been doing for a long time. So one of the ways that we can use the spotlight is to thank women and honor women's leadership going forward today, tomorrow, and into the future. Now, having said that, I'm going to share with you a paradigm shifting perspective on the issues of gender violence, sexual assault, domestic violence, relationship abuse, sexual harassment, sexual abuse of children, that whole range of issues that I'll refer to in shorthand as gender violence issues. They've been seen as women's issues that some good men help out with. But I have a problem with that frame, and I don't accept it. I don't see these as women's issues that some good men help out with. In fact, I'm going to argue that these are men's issues, first and foremost. Now, obviously, there are also women's issues, so I appreciate that. But calling gender violence a women's issue is part of the problem for a number of reasons. The first is that it gives men an excuse not to pay attention, right? A lot of men hear the term women's issues and we tend to tune it out and we think, hey, I'm a guy, that's for the girls or that's for the women. And a lot of men literally don't get beyond the first sentence as a result. It's almost like a chip in our brain is activated and the neural pathways take our attention in a different direction when we hear the term women's issues. This is also true, by the way, of the word gender, because a lot of people hear the word gender and they think it means women. So they think that gender issues is synonymous with women's issues. There's some confusion about the term gender. And actually, let me illustrate that confusion by way of analogy. So let's talk for a moment about race. In the US, when we hear the word race, a lot of people think that means African American, Latino, Asian American, Native American, South Asian, Pacific Islander, on and on. A lot of people, when they hear the word sexual orientation, think it means gay, lesbian, bisexual. And a lot of people, when they hear the word gender, think it means women. In each case, the dominant group doesn't get paid attention to, right? As if white people don't have some sort of racial identity or belong to some racial category or construct. As if heterosexual people don't have a sexual orientation. As if men don't have a gender. This is one of the ways that dominant systems maintain and reproduce themselves, which is to say the dominant group is rarely challenged to even think about its dominance, because that's one of the key characteristics of power and privilege, the ability to go unexamined, lacking introspection, and in fact being rendered invisible in large measure in the discourse about issues that are primarily about us. And this is amazing how this works in domestic and sexual violence, how men have been largely erased from so much of the conversation about a subject that is centrally about men. And I'm going to illustrate what I'm talking about by using the old tech. I'm old school on some fundamental regards. I make films and I work with, high tech, but I'm still old school as an educator. And I want to share with you this exercise that illustrates on the sentence structure level how the way that we think, literally the way that we use language, conspires to keep our attention off of men. This is about domestic violence in particular, but you can plug in other analogs. This comes from the work of the feminist linguist Julia Penelope. It starts with a very basic English sentence. John beat Mary. That's a good English sentence. John is the subject, beat is the verb, Mary is the object. Good sentence. Now we're going to move to the second sentence, which says the same thing in the passive voice. Mary was beaten by John. And now a whole lot has happened in one sentence. We've gone from John beat Mary to Mary was beaten by John. We've shifted our focus in one sentence from John to Mary. And you can see John is very close to the end of the sentence, well, close to dropping off the map of our psychic plane. The third sentence, John is dropped, and we have Mary was beaten, and now it's all about Mary. We're not even thinking about John. It's totally focused on Mary. Over the past generation, the term we've used synonymous with beaten is battered. So we have Mary was battered. And the final sentence in this sequence, flowing from the others, is Mary is a battered woman. So now Mary's very identity, Mary is a battered woman, is what was done to her by John in the first instance. But we've demonstrated that John has long ago left the conversation. Now, those of us who work in domestic and sexual violence field know that victim blaming is pervasive in this realm, which is to say blaming the person to whom something was done rather than the person who did it. And we say things like, why do these women go out with these men? Why are they attracted to these men? Why do they keep going back? What was she wearing at that party? What a stupid thing to do. Why was she drinking with that group of guys in that hotel room? This is victim blaming. And there are numerous reasons for it, but one of them is that our whole cognitive structure is set up to blame victims. This is all unconscious. Our whole cognitive structure is set up to ask questions about women and women's choices and what they're doing, thinking, and wearing. And I'm not going to shout down people who ask questions about women. Okay, it's a legitimate thing to ask. But let's be clear, asking questions about Mary is not going to get us anywhere in terms of preventing violence. We have to ask a different set of questions. You can see where I'm going with this, right? The questions are not about Mary, they're about John. The questions include things like, why does John beat Mary? Why is domestic violence still a big problem in the United States and all over the world? What's going on? Why do so many men abuse physically, emotionally, and verbally and other ways the women and girls and the men and boys that they claim to love? What's going on with men? Why do so many adult men sexually abuse little girls and little boys? Why is that a common problem in our society and all over the world today? Why? Why do we hear over and over again about new scandals erupting in major institutions like the Catholic Church or the Penn State football program or the Boy Scouts of America, on and on and on, and then local communities all over the country and all the world, right? We hear about it all the time. Sexual abuse of children. What's going on with men? Why do so many men rape women in our society and around the world? Why do so many men rape other men? What is going on with men? And then what is the role of the various institutions in our society that are helping to produce abusive men at pandemic rates? Because this isn't about individual perpetrators. That's a naive way to understanding what is a much deeper and more systematic social problem. The perpetrators aren't these, monsters who crawl out of the swamp and come into town and do their nasty business and then retreat into the darkness. That's a very naive notion, right? Perpetrators are much more normal than that and everyday than that. So the question is, what are we doing here in our society and in the world? What are the roles of the various institutions in helping to produce abusive men? What's the role of religious belief systems, the sports culture, the pornography culture, the family structure, economics and how that intersects, and race and ethnicity and how that intersects? How does all this work? And then once we start making those kind of connections and asking those important and big questions, then we can talk about how can we be transformative. In other words, how can we do something differently? How can we change the practices? How can we change the socialization of boys and the definitions of manhood that lead to these current outcomes? These are the kind of questions that we need to be asking and the kind of work that we need to be doing. But if we're endlessly focused on what women are doing and thinking in relationships or elsewhere, we're not going to get to that piece. Now, I understand that a lot of women who have been trying to speak out about these issues today and yesterday and for years and years often get shouted down for their efforts. They get called nasty names like male basher and man hater and the disgusting and offensive feminazi, right? You know what all this is about? It's called kill the messenger. It's because the women who are standing up and speaking out for themselves and for other women, as well as for men and boys, it's a statement to them to sit down and shut up. Keep the current system in place because we don't like it when people rock the boat. We don't like it when people challenge our power. You better sit down and shut up, basically. And thank goodness that women haven't done that. Thank goodness that we live in a world where there's so much women's leadership that can counteract that. But one of the powerful roles that men can play in this work is that we can say some things that sometimes women can't say, or better yet, we can be heard saying some things that women often can't be heard saying. Now, I appreciate that's a problem. It's sexism, but it's the truth. And so one of the things that I say to men, and my colleagues and I always say this, is we need more men who have the courage and the strength to start standing up and saying some of this stuff. And standing with women, not against them, pretending that somehow this is a battle between the sexes and other kinds of nonsense. We live in the world together. And by the way, one of the things that really bothers me about some of the rhetoric that against feminists and others who have built the battered women's and rape crisis movements around the world is that somehow, like I said, that they're anti-male. What about all the boys who are profoundly affected in a negative way by what some adult man is doing against their mother, themselves, their sisters? What about all those boys? What about all the young men and boys who have been traumatized by adult men's violence? You know what? The same system that produces men who abuse women produces men who abuse other men. And if we want to talk about male victims, let's talk about male victims. Most male victims of violence are the victims of other men's violence. So that's something that both women and men have in common. We are both victims of men's violence. So we have it in our direct self-interest, not to mention the fact that most men that I know have women and girls that we care deeply about in our families and our friendship circles and every other way. So there's so many reasons why we need men to speak out. It seems obvious saying it out loud, doesn't it? Now, the nature of the work that I do and my colleagues do in the sports culture, in the US military, in schools, we pioneered this approach called the bystander approach to gender violence prevention. And I just want to give you the highlights of the bystander approach because it's a big sort of thematic shift, although there's lots of particulars. But the heart of it is, instead of seeing men as perpetrators, women as victims, or women as perpetrators, men as victims, or any combination in there, I'm using the gender binary. I know there's more than men and women. There's more than male and female. And there are women who are perpetrators, and of course there are men who are victims. There's a whole spectrum. But instead of seeing it in the binary fashion, we focus on all of us as what we call bystanders. And a bystander is defined as anybody who is not a perpetrator or a victim in a given situation. So in other words, friends, teammates, colleagues, coworkers, family members, those of us who are not directly involved in a dyad of abuse, but we are embedded in social, family, work, school, and other peer culture relationships with people who might be in that situation. What do we do? How do we speak up? How do we challenge our friends? How do we support our friends? But how do we not remain silent in the face of abuse? Now, when it comes to men and male culture, the goal is to get men who are not abusive to challenge men who are. And when I say abusive, I don't mean just men who are beating women. We're not just saying that a man whose friend is abusing his girlfriend needs to stop the guy at the moment of attack. I mean, that's a naive way of creating a social change. It's along a continuum we're trying to get men to interrupt each other. So for example, if you're a guy and you're in a group of guys playing poker, talking, hanging out, no women present, and another guy says something sexist or degrading or harassing about women, instead of laughing along or pretending you didn't hear it, we need men to say, hey, that's not funny. It could be my sister you're talking about, and could you joke about something else? Or could you talk about something else? I don't appreciate that kind of talk. Just like if you're a white person and another white person makes a racist comment, I hope, that white people would interrupt that racist enactment by a fellow white person. Just like with heterosexism, if you're a heterosexual person and you yourself don't enact harassing or abusive behaviors towards people of varying sexual orientations, if you don't say something in the face of other heterosexual people doing that, then in a sense, isn't your silence a form of consent and complicity? Well, the bystander approach is trying to give people tools to interrupt that process and to speak up and to create a peer culture climate where the abusive behavior will be seen as unacceptable, not just because it's illegal, but because it's wrong and unacceptable in the peer culture. And if we can get to the place where men who act out in sexist ways will lose status, young men and boys who act out in sexist and harassing ways towards girls and women, as well as towards other boys and men, will lose status as a result of it, guess what? We'll see a radical diminution of the abuse, because the typical perpetrator is not sick and twisted. He's a normal guy in every other way, isn't he? Now, among the many great things that Martin Luther King said in his short life was, in the end, what'll hurt the most is not the words of our enemies, but the silence of our friends. In the end, what'll hurt the most is not the words of our enemies, but the silence of our friends. There's been an awful lot of silence in male culture about this ongoing tragedy of men's violence against women and children, hasn't there? There's been an awful lot of silence. And all I'm saying is that we need to break that silence, and we need more men to do that. Now, it's easier said than done, because I'm saying it now, but I'm telling you, it's not easy in male culture for guys to challenge each other, which is one of the reasons why part of the paradigm shift that has to happen is not just understanding these issues as men's issues, but they're also leadership issues for men. Because ultimately, the responsibility for taking a stand on these issues should not fall on the shoulder of little boys or teenage boys in high school or college men. It should be on adult men with power. Adult men with power are the ones we need to be holding accountable for being leaders on these issues. Because when somebody speaks up in a peer culture and challenges and interrupts, he or she is being a leader, really, right? But on a big scale, we need more adult men with power to start prioritizing these issues. And we haven't seen that yet, have we? Now, I was at a dinner a number of years ago, and I work extensively with the US military, all the services. And I was at this dinner, and this woman said to me, I think she thought she was a little clever. She said, "So how long have you been doing sensitivity training with the Marines?" And I said, with all due respect, I don't do sensitivity training with the Marines. I run a leadership program in the Marine Corps. Now, I know it's a bit pompous, my response, but it's an important distinction, because I don't believe that what we need is sensitivity training. We need leadership training. Because, for example, when a professional coach or manager of a baseball team or football team, and I work extensively in that realm as well, makes a sexist comment, makes a homophobic statement, makes a racist comment, there'll be discussions on the sports blogs and in sports talk radio, and some people say, well, he needs sensitivity training, and other people will say, well, get off it, that's political correctness run amok, and he made a stupid statement, move on. My argument is he doesn't need sensitivity training, he needs leadership training, because he's being a bad leader. Because in a society with gender diversity and sexual diversity and racial and ethnic diversity, you make those kind of comments, you're failing at your leadership. If we can make this point that I'm making to powerful men and women in our society at all levels of institutional authority and power, it's going to change. It's going to change the paradigm of people's thinking. For example, I work a lot in college and university athletics throughout North America, right? We know so much about how to prevent domestic and sexual violence, right? There's no excuse for a college or university to not have domestic and sexual violence prevention training mandated for all student athletes, coaches, and administrators as part of their educational process. We know enough to know that we can easily do that, but you know what's missing? The leadership. But it's not the leadership of student athletes. It's the leadership of the athletic director, the president of the university, the people in charge who make decisions about resources and who make decisions about priorities in the institutional settings, right? That's a failure in most cases of men's leadership. Look at Penn State. Penn State is the mother of all teachable moments for the bystander approach. You had so many situations in that realm where men in powerful positions failed to act to protect children, in this case, boys. It's unbelievable, really. But when you get into it, you realize there are pressures on men. There are constraints within peer cultures on men, which is why we need to encourage men to break through those pressures. And one of the ways to do that is to say there's an awful lot of men who care deeply about these issues. I know this. I work with men, and I've been working with tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of men for many, many decades now. It's scary when you think about it, how many years. But there's so many men who care deeply about these issues, but caring deeply is not enough. We need more men with the guts, with the courage, with the strength, with the moral integrity to break our complicit silence and challenge each other and stand with women, not against them. By the way, we owe it to women. There's no question about it, but we also owe it to our sons. We also owe it to young men who are growing up all over the world in situations where they didn't make the choice to be a man in a culture that tells them that manhood is a certain way. They didn't make the choice. We that have a choice have an opportunity and a responsibility to them as well. I hope that going forward, men and women working together can begin the change and the transformation that'll happen so that future generations won't have the level of tragedy that we deal with on a daily basis. I know we can do it. We can do better. Thank you very much.
In the TED Talk, we hear about the recurring theme that sexual misconduct is commonly thought of as a women's issue, when in fact it should be viewed as a men's issue. Please take 5 minutes to reflect on these questions and whatever conversations they bring up in small groups or through journaling. How do you see this theme recur in your daily life? How might you approach having conversations about sexual violence and misconduct differently now that you have seen this TED Talk?
The patriarchy is the overarching system of oppression which results in and influences rape culture, misogyny, and toxic masculinity. To reiterate from the first block, rape culture is a society in which sexual violence is normalized, and the burden to end it falls on the survivors.
Misogyny is a main impact of the patriarchy and is generally defined as a hatred, dislike, or distrust of women. Misogyny can be both institutional and interpersonal, and can manifest as intimidation, abuse, prejudice, among other things. Misogyny can present itself externally, for example, comments about a woman's appearance and or body, being mistaken for a role that is stereotypically female, doctor mistaken for nurse, double standards, or being told women can't and or shouldn't do certain things. Internal misogyny is when women consciously or subconsciously project sexist ideas onto other women and even onto themselves. Examples of this could be women pitting themselves against each other, believing women should conform to certain standards and stereotypes, judging other women based on appearance and or clothing, believing sexual violence is the victim's fault, and making other women look bad in front of men to impress them. Toxic masculinity is a culture of pressure directed at men to behave in a violent, homophobic, and anti-feminine way, which negatively impacts themselves and society as a whole. Toxic masculinity directly leads to gender-based violence, anti-LGBTQ+ violence, issues with mental health, along with suppression of emotions and trauma. Toxic masculinity is simultaneously societal and interpersonal. It occurs in friend groups, within families, in school and sports, and internally within male-identifying people.
Much of how society functions comes from messaging we receive from the media. When we consume media, only 8% of it is processed by our conscious minds, and the rest is processed by our subconscious. This leads to the internalization of a lot of problematic ideas, ones that we may not even know that we hold. We are taught that strong, desirable, and successful men don't show emotions. In our culture, emotional openness is viewed as a weakness, and therefore men are discouraged from being open about how they feel. In the media, male role models are portrayed as emotionless, which enforces the idea that men should be dominant, powerful, and independent, and can overcome any sort of obstacle or moments of temporary weakness. There is one exception to men being taught not to be emotionally open, and that is with anger. Aggression and anger are actually encouraged among male-identifying people in our culture as a way to prove masculinity. When any group of people is taught that the only acceptable way to show all the emotions that they're having is through demonstrations of anger, violence inevitably occurs. Another thing to note is that male role models in media are almost always white and cisgendered. Finally, masculine men are limited to certain jobs and put their work above their family, which is seen as a positive sacrifice in our media culture. As for women, the media portrays women as overly weak and helpless, while simultaneously hypersexualizing and objectifying them. Not only do we look down upon femininity presented in women, we characterize femininity in male-identifying people as weak. We can see this in movies many of us watch growing up, such as with Disney princess movies, where the princesses are portrayed as damsels in distress who are weak and in need of saving by a strong male character. As is stated in the documentary Killing Us Softly, quote, turning a human being into a thing is almost always the first step towards justifying violence against that person, end quote. This quote explains how the objectification of women directly plays into gender oppression and violence against women. Content warning. The next section of this presentation contains mentions of anti-Blackness and racially motivated violence. Once again, please feel free to step out or turn off your sound and camera. Patriarchy and systemic racism are closely linked, and one of the most prevalent ways we see this take place in our society is through the hyper-aggressive portrayal of Black men. The media depicts Black men as overly violent and more likely to commit crimes. The media also coddles white women and portrays them as very weak. The combination of the hyper-aggressive portrayal of Black men and the over-coddling of white women has led to extremely harmful relationships between the two groups. White women yield an enormous amount of power in our society and oftentimes exert it in a sexual nature over Black men. There's a deep history of this relationship, beginning with slavery and the violation of Black bodies of all genders. During the Jim Crow era, Black men and boys would be lynched and murdered under the presumption that they had made advances towards a white woman. This is seen through the popular film Birth of a Nation, which was the first movie watched in the White House, where a Black man is lynched for raping a white woman. Many other famous incidents, such as the trial of the Scottsboro Nine and the murder of Emmett Till, also depict this relationship. During mass incarceration and the tough on crime era, which we are living in to this day, Black men have been described and portrayed as super predators, with white women as their apparent victims.
The media teaches male-identifying people that anger is the only acceptable emotion to feel, and that all other emotions are undesirable, which results in increased violence among these groups. Any other type of emotion is considered feminine and unfavorable, which not only leads to male-identifying people suppressing these emotions, but to taking out their aggression towards people who have feminine traits. Media portrayals of toxic masculinity lead to increased violence, anger, and poor mental health among male-identifying groups. This is an excerpt from The Opposite of Rape Culture is Nurturance Culture by Nora Samaran, which we will be referencing later on as well. It does a great job explaining some of the harm that toxic masculinity brings about on people of all genders. The impacts of toxic masculinity are both internal and external and can present themselves in different ways. Internal impacts look like having unhealthy coping mechanisms to deal with emotions, stress, conflict, and more. Many men have few male-identifying friends who they are comfortable going to when they are dealing with mental health issues or need to talk about their emotions. This leads to a culture in which male-identifying people aren't given the opportunity to work through their issues and engage in honest conversations, which severely limits abilities to engage in meaningful relationships. External impacts of toxic masculinity are more about the harm done onto others. Because men are taught the only acceptable emotion to feel is anger, much of their emotions are expressed through actions of destruction and violence. Assuming men are leaders, moneymakers, and protectors associates them with being selfish, power-hungry, and aggressive. This does not mean that men aren't caring, compassionate, or emotional, but we, as a society, don't value these traits in men, and that can lead men to believe these traits aren't valuable. This culture creates a dynamic in which harm is done to oneself and onto others. Toxic masculinity limits the clothes, emotions, people, sports, and interactions men are able to have with both themselves and the world. This directly affects men's mental health in a negative way. Toxic masculinity also creates a culture where homophobia towards men is normalized. It is very unacceptable to experiment with sexuality as a man. These homophobic messages are internalized, which leads to a lot of sexual violence towards gay men. Many men have few male-identifying friends who they are comfortable going to when they are dealing with mental health issues or need to talk about their emotions with. While it is completely okay to go to non-cis men for assistance, it is important to have people who you share your identity with that you can talk to about these deep issues. This is especially prevalent in heterosexual relationships, where men can be isolated in who they talk to about their emotional issues. This can be problematic when dealing with relationship issues and breakups.
Content warning. The next section of this presentation contains mentions of sexual violence towards the LGBTQ+ community. Please feel free to step out or turn off your sound and camera. We cannot fully understand the spectrum of gender-based violence without understanding the disproportionate impacts on the LGBTQ+ community. Though the general focus of information about sexual assault and harassment today is on binary genders, it would be wrong and incorrect to not present all the facts in order to encompass the issues with sexual assault and harassment that the LGBTQ community experiences. These are not issues that are exclusive to one group or some groups. Everybody is negatively impacted by the patriarchy.
Sports culture is a perfect example of toxic masculinity. By no means are we saying that sports are inherently toxic, or that if you're a man who plays a sport, you are toxic. Rather, what we're saying is that the culture of sports among men can easily foster a culture of toxic masculinity. Men in sports are encouraged to be aggressive, to push through and downplay whatever emotions they're having, and to hyper-focus on the appearance of their bodies. Sports culture is harmful for everyone, not just the athletes, and its effects are seen outside of the sport itself.
Content warning. The next section of this presentation contains mentions of suicide. Once again, please feel free to step out or turn off your sound and camera if need be. Because male-identifying people are encouraged not to show emotions and be vulnerable, it is much harder for them to seek help for mental health. Healthy coping mechanisms such as therapy are often highly stigmatized and looked down upon among groups of men. The stigma around therapy is especially prevalent in communities of color due to economic injustice, lack of diversity among therapists, and the history of invalidation of issues pertaining to people of color. These factors make it much more difficult for men of color to seek help with mental health issues. Furthermore, male victims of sexual assault feel the stigma around therapy along with the stigma around male sexual assault victims in general. Oftentimes, male sexual assault victims are told they're weak for quote-unquote letting themselves be assaulted, which is extremely harmful. The stigma around mental health leads to considerably higher suicide rates among men. Toxic masculinity encourages men to be violent while dehumanizing and portraying femininity as negative. This, combined with the stigma around mental health, leads to increased gender-based violence. Many perpetrators of gender-based violence have unprocessed trauma and past experiences as victims of violence. This doesn't make gender-based violence acceptable. Rather, it explains that violence doesn't exist in a vacuum and is very cyclical. In order to escape from this cycle, we must support ourselves and one another as we embark on a process of healing together. While we currently live in a society where toxic masculinity is prevalent and seen as a positive, change can come at a personal level. This is another excerpt from The Opposite of Rape Culture is Nurturance Culture by Nora Samaron, which explains how masculinity can be transformed from toxic to nurturing. By making these personal changes, we move closer to liberation, and by bringing about these changes into spaces you live, work, or exist in, you are helping liberate people of all genders.
Please take 10 minutes to reflect on whichever questions you feel comfortable with in small groups or through journaling.
Thank you so much for engaging with this presentation today. On your way out, you will receive information about ways to manage strong negative emotions and contact information for local mental health supports. As a reminder, please reach out to your trusted adults, including guidance counselors, social workers, psychologists, and teachers if you need support. Ask for help. You are seen and heard, and we are all here for you.